No date, no husband, no family.
After all these years? Oh, stop it, you two.
Just looking out for you.
A billionaire stood in the middle of a packed New York charity gala and laughed at his ex-wife for being alone. "Still single, Beverly," George Bunny said loudly, his voice slicing through the soft jazz drifting across the ballroom. "No date, no husband, no family. After all these years?" A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest cluster of guests. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to sting. The kind of laughter people used when they wanted to align themselves with power instead of truth. Beverly Williams didn't flinch. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, one hand resting lightly against a marble column, her posture straight and composed. Her navy blue dress was simple, elegant, and deliberately understated. No diamonds glittered at her ears. No designer logo announced itself from her wrist or handbag. In a room obsessed with spectacle, Beverly looked quietly human. George Bunny noticed that, and it irritated him more than he expected. He tightened his arm around his fiancée, Lillian, who wore a crimson gown that shimmered under the chandelier lights. Lillian leaned into him comfortably, the picture of effortless glamour. The future Mrs. Bunny. Young, beautiful, untouchable. "Some people just don't move forward," George continued, his lips curling into a confident smile. "You had your chance." Beverly met his eyes then, calm, steady, unafraid. "My children will be here in 4 minutes," she said. The room froze. The string quartet continued playing, but no one was listening anymore. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Champagne glasses hovered inches from lips, forgotten. George blinked once, then laughed. "Children?" he said, still shaking his head. "Don't embarrass yourself." Beverly glanced at her watch. 3 minutes. Something shifted in the air. Not loud, not obvious, but unmistakable. Because in that moment everyone felt it. Whatever was about to happen would destroy someone's life. Before that destruction arrived, before the doors opened and the truth walked in, the night itself deserved context. Because this wasn't just any party. It was the party. The annual Valentine's Charity Gala was held inside one of Manhattan's most historic art museums, a space reserved for people who donated 6 figures without blinking. The museum had closed early to the public. Soft, golden lighting bathed priceless artwork. Crystal chandeliers hung low, casting reflections across polished marble floors. This wasn't a fundraiser. It was a performance. A place where success was worn like armor, where wealth announced itself in subtle, expensive ways, where everyone was watching everyone else, measuring worth in silent calculations. George Bunny moved through the room like he belonged there, because he did. At 40 years old, George was the definition of a self-made billionaire, founder of a tech empire that touched everything from finance to healthcare. His name appeared regularly in business magazines, Forbes lists, and investment headlines. He had donated millions to the museum over the years, enough to ensure his presence wasn't just welcomed, it was expected. Tonight, he wore a tailored black tuxedo that fit him perfectly. His watch alone cost more than most people's cars. His posture was relaxed, confident, practiced. This was his world now, and he loved it. Lillian fit seamlessly at his side. She understood the game. She knew when to smile, when to laugh, when to lean in and whisper something flattering into George's ear while others watched. She worked in luxury brand marketing, a career built on perception and presentation. Being seen mattered. Being desired mattered. They made a stunning couple. People said so constantly. Perfect together, someone murmured as they passed. George smiled every time he heard it. Everything was exactly as it should be. Until he saw Beverly. She stood near the sculpture wing, speaking quietly with one of the museum coordinators. Her hair was pulled back neatly, exposing a familiar profile George had once known intimately. She hadn't changed much. Still understated. Still calm. Still ordinary. "What is she doing here?" George muttered. Lillian followed his gaze. Who? My ex-wife. Lillian's expression shifted subtly, curious, calculating. Why would she be invited? George already knew the answer. His mother. Margaret Bunny sat across the room near a cluster of board members, her posture regal, her silver hair styled impeccably. She had never approved of the divorce, had loved Beverly like a daughter, and Margaret Bunny had influence, especially within the museum's board. George felt irritation rise in his chest. Old resentment. Old guilt, buried under years of success and distraction. Before he could turn away, his younger brother Daniel appeared at his side. "Mom invited Beverly," Daniel said quietly. "Don't start anything." "I'm not starting anything," George replied smoothly. Daniel's eyes lingered on him. You already finished enough." The words hit harder than George expected, but he brushed them off. Tonight was about moving forward, not backward. He turned back to his conversations, discussing venture capital, new acquisitions, future plans. He laughed. He charmed. He impressed. But his eyes kept drifting back to Beverly. She stayed near the edges of the room, spoke politely, smiled when spoken to, checked her phone more than once, typed something, slipped it back into her purse, checked again minutes later. George noticed and misinterpreted, waiting for someone, he assumed, someone who would never come. By 8 o'clock, the guests gathered near the central gallery for a champagne toast. The museum director spoke briefly, thanking donors for their generosity. Applause followed. The quartet shifted to a romantic melody. As the couples moved closer together, Lillian slipped her arm through George's. "This night is perfect," she whispered. George nodded. "It is." But his eyes weren't on her. They were on Beverly, standing alone, and something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was the unresolved anger. Maybe it was the fear he never admitted, that leaving Beverly had been a mistake, and the only way to silence that fear was to prove she was the problem. He raised his voice. "Still single, Beverly? Still alone on Valentine's Day?" The music continued, but no one heard it anymore. Beverly looked up slowly, calm, unshaken. George stepped closer, emboldened by the attention. The crowd parted instinctively, forming a quiet circle around them. "How long has it been now?" he continued. 3 years? And you're still here?" Beverly said nothing. George gestured casually to his life, his fiancée, his watch, the room itself. "You could have had all of this, but you wanted simple, small, and look where that got you." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others watched eagerly. Margaret Bunny started toward them, her face pale. "George, that's enough." He ignored her. Beverly stood perfectly still, her phone now resting in her hand. "My children will be here in 4 minutes," she said again. Silence. George laughed, louder this time. "Listen to that. She's making up stories now." Lillian stepped forward, her smile sharp. "It's okay to be alone, Beverly. You don't need to lie." "I'm not lying," Beverly replied. She checked her watch. 3 minutes. And just like that, the countdown began. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and comment the city you're watching from. Stories like this grow because of your support, and what's coming next changes everything. George crossed his arms, confidence masking something darker beneath. This was absurd. Beverly was bluffing. She had to be. But as the seconds passed, even George began to wonder. 30 seconds. 20. 15. The side doors behind Beverly remained closed. George stared at them, and hated that his heart was pounding. 5 seconds. 4. 3. 2. 1. The doors did not open. They stood there instead, tall, dark, and immovable, framing the quietest moment the ballroom had experienced all night. 4 minutes. That was all Beverly had said. Not an explanation, not a defense, just a number. George Bunny glanced at his watch, then quickly looked away, annoyed at himself for even checking. This was ridiculous. A bluff. A desperate attempt to regain dignity after public humiliation. He had seen it before, people grasping for relevance when they had nothing left. Around them, the air tightened. People shifted closer together, whispering behind raised champagne flutes and cupped hands. Phones appeared subtly, screens lighting up as guests pretended to check messages while angling their cameras toward the unfolding scene. Someone murmured, "Is she serious?" Another whispered, "Does she even have kids?" A third voice, sharper and crueler, added, "This is embarrassing." Beverly heard none of it, or at least she didn't react. She stood with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. She wasn't scanning the room for sympathy. She wasn't pleading, or she wasn't defending herself. She was waiting. George noticed that too, and it unsettled him. He cleared his throat loudly, forcing a chuckle. "Well," he said, turning slightly so the crowd could hear, "this should be entertaining." A few people laughed, uncertain but eager to stay aligned with him. Laughter was safer than silence. Lillian tightened her grip on George's arm. Her smile hadn't disappeared, but it had stiffened, frozen into something practiced rather than genuine. "This is awkward," she whispered under her breath. Why would she say something like that? George leaned closer, because she wants attention. But even as he said it, a flicker of doubt crept in. 1 minute had already passed. George told himself not to look at Beverly again. But his eyes betrayed him. She had taken out her phone. She glanced at the screen briefly, then slipped it back into her purse. No rush, no panic, no dramatic sigh, just quiet certainty. George's confidence wavered. He tried to remember. Had Beverly ever lied like this before? No. She had always been painfully honest. Too honest, in his opinion. She never exaggerated, never embellished, never played games. That was part of why he had left her. Another wave of whispers moved through the room. "Why isn't she nervous?" someone asked. "Maybe it's a setup," another replied. "Borrowed kids?" George latched onto that idea instantly. Yes, that made sense. People did insane things when they were desperate. This was probably some elaborate stunt. Hired children, maybe, just to save face. Pathetic, but predictable. 2 minutes left. George straightened his shoulders and leaned into his role, raising his voice again. "You know, Beverly," he said, smiling broadly, "you really don't have to keep this going. Everyone here understands. Being alone isn't a crime." A few polite chuckles followed. Lillian nodded, adding sweetly, "There's no shame in it, truly." Beverly finally looked up at them. Her eyes met George's. Not angry, not pleading, just steady. "1 minute," she said. The room went quiet again. This time, no one laughed. George's heart thudded once, hard enough that he felt it in his throat. He swallowed. He didn't like this silence. It wasn't obedient. It wasn't flattering. It wasn't on his terms. He glanced toward his mother. Margaret Bunny stood rigid near the edge of the crowd, her lips pressed together, her eyes fixed on Beverly with an expression George couldn't read. Fear? Hope? Recognition? Daniel stood beside her, arms crossed, his jaw clenched. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't whispering. He was watching. George felt irritation spike again. Why was everyone taking this so seriously? 30 seconds. Someone coughed. The sound echoed too loudly. A champagne glass clinked against another, then was hastily lowered. The string quartet continued playing softly, but the music felt wrong now. Out of place, like background noise to a disaster. George forced another laugh. "All right," he said, spreading his hands. "We'll wait." Why did that sound less confident than he intended? Lillian shifted beside him. Her fingers fidgeted against his sleeve. "What if—" she started, then stopped herself. "What?" George asked sharply. Nothing, she said quickly. It's just strange. He wanted to snap at her but held back. This wasn't the time. 15 seconds. George's gaze drifted, unwillingly, back to the doors behind Beverly. They led to the museum's service corridor, the staff entrance, the parking area beyond. Nothing moved. 10 seconds. He told himself he was imagining the tightness in his chest. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nothing happened. A wave of relief rushed through George so quickly it almost made him dizzy. He exhaled, smiling broadly. Well, he said loudly, it looks like... Then he stopped, because Beverly wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, toward the doors. A beat passed, then tap. A soft sound echoed across the marble floor. Not loud, not dramatic, just small. A footstep. George's smile froze. Another step followed. Tap, tap. Someone near the front of the crowd sucked in a sharp breath. George's heart slammed against his ribs. The doors began to open. Slowly, too slowly. An older woman stepped inside first. She looked nervous, clutching a large tote bag close to her chest. Her hair was silver, her expression anxious as she scanned the room, clearly overwhelmed by the grandeur and the attention. George didn't recognize her. Then he saw movement behind her. Small figures. 3 of them. They emerged hesitantly at first, peeking around the woman's legs before stepping fully into the light. 3 little boys. They couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old. They wore matching coats, tiny shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. Their dark hair was neatly combed, their faces curious and open as they looked around the enormous room filled with strangers. The whispering exploded instantly. Oh my God, are those... Who are they? George felt his breath catch, though he couldn't have said why. The boys looked around once more, and then their faces changed. Their eyes lit up. Pure, unfiltered joy spread across all 3 of them at the exact same moment. Mommy! The word rang out together, high and clear, echoing off marble and glass. The boys broke into a run, straight toward Beverly. She dropped to her knees instinctively, her composure finally cracking as she opened her arms wide. They collided with her, laughing, talking all at once, wrapping their small arms around her neck, her shoulders, her waist. Mommy! We missed you. We made cards. Beverly laughed through tears, pressing kisses into their hair, holding them tightly as if the entire room had disappeared. The gala ceased to exist. George Bunny stood frozen, because now he could see their faces clearly, and something deep inside him went cold. Their eyes, that unmistakable shade of green. The same green George saw every morning in the mirror. The room fell silent. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. Lillian's fingers loosened on George's arm. George, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They look just like you. George couldn't respond. His mind refused to process what his eyes were telling him. The boys laughed again, their smiles flashing, and with them the dimples. The same dimples that ran through the Bunny family for generations. The resemblance was undeniable. And as George stared at the 3 small boys clinging to the woman he had mocked minutes earlier, a horrifying realization began to surface. Not as a thought, but as a truth. And the first small footstep that had echoed across the marble floor was only the beginning. The word hit the room like a dropped glass. Mommy! Not one voice. 3. High, bright, overflowing with joy. The sound echoed off marble walls and vaulted ceilings, cutting through the tension like a blade. It didn't belong in that room of wealth and restraint. It was too honest. Too alive. The 3 little boys ran. Their small shoes squeaked against the polished floor as they weaved past stunned adults frozen in place. They moved with the reckless confidence of children who knew exactly where they were going, straight to Beverly. She dropped to her knees before they reached her. In one fluid motion, the composure she had held for 4 minutes, 4 years, collapsed. Her arms flew open just as the boys crashed into her, laughing, shouting, clinging to her dress, her shoulders, her neck. "Mommy! We missed you. We waited." Beverly laughed and sobbed at the same time, her face crumpling as she gathered all 3 of them against her chest. She pressed her lips into their hair, over and over again, as if touching them anchored her to reality. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here." The boys talked over one another, their voices tumbling out in a rush of excitement, stories about cards they made, snacks they ate, how long the car ride felt. Beverly listened to all of it, nodding, smiling through tears, her hands smoothing their hair, holding them as if the world might try to take them away. For a brief moment, nothing else existed. Not the gala, not the guests, not George Bunny. But George was watching. And the longer he watched, the harder it became to breathe, sick because now the boys' faces were fully visible. Their eyes, bright, unmistakably green. His green. The exact shade he'd inherited from his father. The same color his mother once said made him look like a bunny no matter what he did. His throat tightened. Their noses, straight, strong, with a slight curve at the tip. His nose, their jawlines, defined even at such a young age, giving their faces a seriousness that didn't belong to children. His jawline, and when the boys smiled, wide, unguarded smiles, dimples appeared in their cheeks. Deep dimples. The same ones George saw every time he smiled for a camera. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It wasn't coincidental. It was overwhelming. The crowd felt it too. A low murmur rippled through the room, spreading like wildfire. "Oh my God, do you see it? They look exactly like..." A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing in the silence. No one reacted. No one looked away. All eyes were locked on the scene unfolding at the center of the room. Lillian's fingers tightened on George's arm, then loosened. She stared at the boys, her face draining of color, her lips parting slightly as realization crept in. "George," she whispered. He didn't answer. "George," she said again, louder this time. They look exactly like you." Her voice trembled. George's heart pounded so hard it hurt. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Beverly hadn't had children. He would have known. Someone would have told him. Wouldn't they? The boys finally pulled back just enough to look at Beverly's face, as she cupped each of their cheeks, smiling at them through tears. "You made it," she said softly. "All of you." She looked up then, straight at George. The room went silent. Even the whispers stopped. Even the music seemed to fade. Beverly rose slowly to her feet, keeping the boys close. One held on to her dress. Another pressed against her side. The third clutched her hand tightly, suddenly shy in front of so many strangers. She didn't rush. She didn't dramatize. She simply said the truth. "They're yours!" The words landed like a blow. George staggered back half a step. The room exploded into stunned silence, the kind that rang louder than shouting. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered a curse under their breath. Lillian let go of George's arm completely. "What?" she whispered. Beverly's voice remained steady, even as her hands trembled slightly where the boys couldn't see. "They're your children," she repeated. "Mike, Peter, Tom." George's mind reeled. 3 years ago. The divorce, the paperwork, the final signatures, the calls he ignored, the letters he returned unopened, the door he closed, because he wanted to move on. One of the boys, Mike, the tallest, tilted his head as he looked up at George. His green eyes were wide with curiosity, not fear. "Are you our daddy?" he asked. The question was simple, innocent, devastating. George opened his mouth. No sound came out. Peter stepped closer, holding on to Beverly's sleeve. He studied George's face carefully, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Why didn't you come?" he asked softly. George's chest tightened painfully. Tom, the smallest, stayed quiet a moment longer, and he pressed closer to Beverly's leg, peeking out from behind her dress. Then he whispered, barely audible, "Did we do something wrong?" Something inside George shattered. The words sliced through him, bypassing pride, wealth, ego, cutting straight to the bone. He took a step forward without realizing it, his hand lifting instinctively. He stopped. He didn't know what to do. Didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to fix this. Margaret Bunny pushed through the stunned crowd, her hands shaking as she stared at the boys. Tears streamed freely down her face. "Oh my God," she breathed. Are these my grandchildren?" Beverly looked at her, then nodded. "Yes." Margaret sank to her knees right there on the marble floor, her elegant gown forgotten as she reached out toward the boys, stopping herself inches away, as if afraid they might disappear. "My babies," she whispered. George's father moved closer, his expression hard, unreadable. Daniel stood beside him, his eyes glassy with emotion. George felt suddenly, acutely alone. Lillian took a step back, then another. "You told me there was nothing," she said, her voice sharp now. "You said the divorce was clean." George finally found his voice, though it sounded foreign to his own ears. "I didn't know." Beverly laughed softly, not with humor, but with exhaustion. "I tried to tell you," she said quietly. "You blocked my number. You sent my letters back unopened. You told security not to let me up." George flinched. The room leaned in. "I didn't think you'd listen," Beverly continued, "so I stopped trying." Silence swallowed the space again. Lillian stared at George as if seeing him for the first time. "What else didn't you want to hear?" she asked. She slipped the engagement ring from her finger and held it between them for a moment. Then she dropped it. The diamond bounced once on the marble floor and rolled away into the shadows. "We're done," she said, and walked away. George didn't stop her. He couldn't. He stood there surrounded by people yet utterly alone, staring at the three boys who carried his face, his eyes, his blood. Mike looked up at Beverly again. "Is he really our daddy?" he asked. Beverly knelt once more, bringing herself to their level. She spoke gently, carefully, the way you speak when every word matters. "Yes," she said. "That's your father." 3 pairs of green eyes turned back to George, waiting. George felt the weight of the moment crush down on him. So he had mocked her. He had laughed. And now, in front of everyone who mattered, the truth stood before him. Small, fragile, undeniable. "Daddy?" Mike asked again. The room held its breath, and George Bunny's perfect life finally, irrevocably, collapsed. The room stayed silent. Not the polite silence of a gala, but the heavy, breathless kind that pressed against the ears until it hurt. 60 people stood frozen, watching a moment that could not be undone. 3 small boys waited. They didn't fidget. They didn't cry. They didn't demand answers. They simply looked at George Bunny. Mike stood the tallest, his shoulders squared the way children do when they're trying to be brave. Peter leaned slightly into Beverly's side, his fingers twisted into the fabric of her dress. Tom hovered half-hidden behind her leg, peeking out with wide, uncertain eyes. George felt their gaze like weight on his chest. Mike spoke again, his voice clear and earnest. "Why didn't you come?" It wasn't an accusation. There was no anger in it, just confusion. George opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His mind scrambled for words, excuses, explanations, anything. But every option collapsed under its own ugliness. How do you explain blocked numbers to a 3-year-old? How do you say, "I chose not to listen," without sounding monstrous? Peter tilted his head, studying George's face with unsettling seriousness. "Mommy said you were away," he said. "Were you far?" George swallowed hard. "Yes," he managed, the word barely audible. "Did you miss us?" Peter asked. George's chest tightened so sharply it stole his breath. Before he could respond, a Tom whispered from behind Beverly's leg, his small voice almost lost in the vast room. "Did we do something wrong?" That was the question that broke him. Not shouted, not dramatic, just soft, frightened, and devastating. George felt something inside him fracture, something foundational. His knees weakened, and for a moment he thought he might actually collapse in front of everyone. "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "No, you didn't." His voice cracked. He stopped, because even that answer felt like a lie. Beverly knelt beside her sons, pulling Tom gently into her arms. She pressed a kiss to his hair, her jaw tight as she fought back tears. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said softly. "None of this is because of you." George watched her say the words he should have said years ago. Margaret Bunny stood trembling a few feet away, in her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Tears streamed down her face unchecked. "Oh my God," she whispered. "My grandsons." She stepped forward hesitantly, as if afraid the boys might vanish if she moved too fast. May I say hello?" Beverly nodded. Margaret crouched down, her elegant composure gone, replaced by raw emotion. "I'm your grandma," she said gently. "I didn't know about you, but I'm so glad you're here." Mike looked at her curiously. "Do you know our daddy?" Margaret's breath hitched. "Yes," she said. "I do." She glanced back at George, pain and fury warring in her eyes. George's father moved closer then, his presence commanding even in silence. Richard Bunny was not a man who raised his voice often. He didn't need to. "Did you know?" he asked George quietly. The question cut through the room. George shook his head. "No, I swear. I didn't know." Richard didn't look convinced. "But she tried to tell you," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. George's stomach dropped. He stopped himself. There was no way to soften this. "She called. She sent letters." "And you ignored them," Richard said. "Yes." The word echoed. Richard exhaled slowly, disappointment etched deep into his face. "That wasn't ignorance," he said. "That was choice." George flinched. Daniel stepped forward, his eyes red. "I have kids," he said quietly. "If my wife tried to reach me like that, I'd tear the world apart to listen." George couldn't meet his brother's gaze. Lillian had been silent through all of it. Now she laughed once, sharp, hollow, disbelieving. "So that's it," she said. "That's the story?" George turned to her. "I didn't know about them." "But you didn't want to," Lillian snapped. "That's the difference." She gestured toward Beverly and the boys. "You told me she was obsessed, that she couldn't let go, that she was trying to get money from you." George felt exposed, every lie peeling away in front of the room. "You thought it was inconvenient," Lillian interrupted, "so you erased her." Her voice shook, but it was controlled. Dangerous. "I asked you once," she continued, "if there were any loose ends. You looked me in the eye and said no." George said nothing. Lillian's gaze dropped to the boys again. Her face softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened completely. "I can't do this," she said. She reached up and removed the engagement ring from her finger. The diamond caught the chandelier light, dazzling, obscene. She held it out to him. George stared at it, unable to move. She let it fall. The ring hit the marble floor with a soft, final click and rolled away until it disappeared beneath a table. "I won't marry a man who runs from his own children," Lillian said. "I won't build a future on avoidance." She turned and walked away. Her heels echoed sharply across the room. No one stopped her. No one followed her. George stood alone. Around him, his family gathered instinctively around Beverly and the boys. Margaret laughed and cried at the same time, asking them questions, touching their hands, memorizing their faces. Richard placed a steady hand on Beverly's shoulder, nodding with quiet respect. Daniel knelt to show Peter a photo on his phone. George watched it all from a distance of 10 feet that felt like a mile. Mike glanced back at him. "Oh, Daddy?" he asked hesitantly. George's mouth opened. Nothing came, because the truth had finally settled in, heavy and undeniable. He hadn't missed them by accident. He hadn't been kept away. He had chosen not to know. And now, standing in the wreckage of his own making, George Bunny realized something far worse than losing a fiancé or a reputation. He had run from the most important truth of his life, and it had finally caught him. The gala ended without applause. There was no formal closing speech, no graceful exit. Guests drifted out in clusters, voices hushed, eyes averted, coats pulled on too quickly. Phones buzzed, screens glowed. Photos were already circulating. George Bunny didn't notice any of it. He stood exactly where Lillian had left him, staring at the empty space beside his hand, as if the ring might still be there if he just looked hard enough. It wasn't. Across the room, Beverly gathered her son's coats. She moved efficiently, quietly, shielding them from the stares with practiced instinct. Margaret hovered close, reluctant to let them go, her hand lingering on Mike's shoulder as if afraid time might steal him away again. George didn't approach. He didn't speak. He didn't know how. By the time he finally turned toward the exit, the room felt unfamiliar, hostile even. The same people who had laughed with him earlier now avoided his eyes. A few whispered as he passed. He heard his name. He heard children. He heard unbelievable. Outside, cameras flashed. Someone shouted a question. George kept walking. The penthouse had never felt so large. The floor-to-ceiling windows that once made George feel invincible now reflected a man he barely recognized. His tuxedo wrinkled, his tie loosened, his face drawn tight with shock. He poured himself a drink. Didn't touch it. His phone vibrated endlessly on the counter. Headlines were already forming. Tech billionaires' secret children revealed at charity gala. Engagement ends in public meltdown. Questions rise about George Bunny's past. George turned the phone face down. Silence rushed in. He sank onto the couch, elbows on his knees, hands pressed against his face. The boys' voices echoed in his head. Why didn't you come? Did we do something wrong? He didn't sleep. He didn't move. When the sun finally rose over Manhattan, pale and indifferent, there was a knock at the door. George opened it to find his mother standing there, her posture rigid, her eyes tired from crying. She didn't say hello. She walked past him and set a small cardboard box on the kitchen counter. "I found these in storage," she said. George stared at the box. "What is it?" Margaret looked at him then, really looked at him, and something like grief crossed her face. "Your mail," she said. "From Beverly." George's stomach dropped. She opened the box and lifted out the first envelope. Unopened. His handwriting stared back at him. Return to sender. Margaret placed it in front of him. "There are more," she said quietly. George picked it up with shaking hands. The date was stamped 3 years ago. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "George, I'm pregnant." The word swam. He read it again. And again. Margaret watched him closely as he opened the second letter. "I went to the doctor today. It's not 1 baby. It's 3. George's breath hitched. Triplets. The third letter trembled in his hands. The pregnancy is high risk. They're worried about complications. I tried calling again. He swallowed hard. The fourth letter was shorter. "I was hospitalized last night. The babies are okay. I'm scared." George felt something crack inside his chest. The fifth letter was stained faintly at the corner, as if it had once been wet. "They're talking about surgery. I don't know if I'll make it through without complications. I wish you would answer." Margaret covered her mouth. George couldn't feel his hands anymore. The 6th letter was written in a different pen. The handwriting shakier. The surgery was an emergency. I lost a lot of blood. They said I was lucky. The babies were born early, but stable. 3 boys. And George dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor like something dead. Margaret knelt slowly to pick it up, her movements careful, reverent. "She almost died," Margaret whispered. "Alone." George slid off the couch onto the floor. His body folded in on itself as the reality finally crushed him. She hadn't hidden the truth. He had buried it. He pressed his fists into his eyes, his shoulders shaking as a sound tore out of him. Raw, broken, animal. "I didn't know," he choked. Margaret's voice was firm, unforgiving. "You didn't want to." The words landed harder than any accusation. George looked around the penthouse. The glass, the steel, the art, the emptiness. All of it built on momentum. All of it built on running forward and never looking back. Except the past had waited. Patient. Relentless. Margaret rested a hand on his shoulder. "Beverly didn't ask me for money," she said softly. "She asked me once if you were happy." George sobbed. For the first time in his life, money couldn't shield him. Success couldn't excuse him. Silence couldn't save him. He saw Beverly alone in a hospital bed. Saw 3 incubators. Saw letters returned unopened. And he knew, truly knew, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was avoidance. And it had almost killed her. George wiped his face slowly and pushed himself to his feet. "Where is she?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "Are you sure?" George nodded. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "But I won't run again." The words felt heavy. Necessary. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside, George Bunny made a decision that would cost him everything, or finally make him worthy of something. He grabbed his coat and walked toward the door. Beverly didn't invite George in. She stood in the doorway of her apartment, one hand resting lightly against the frame, her body angled so he could see inside, but not step past her. Behind her, the space was modest. Clean. Lived in. Toys lined one corner of the living room. 3 small backpacks hung neatly on the hooks near the door. The smell of something warm, pasta maybe, lingered in the air. A home. George had never been here before. He shifted his weight, suddenly unsure of his posture, his hands, his voice. The billionaire who had once commanded boardrooms and dominated negotiations now looked like a man waiting to be judged. "I won't stay long," he said. Beverly studied him for a moment, not with anger, with measurement. "Good," she replied calmly. "Why, neither will I." She stepped aside, not as permission, but as a boundary, and George entered. They sat across from each other at a small kitchen table. No wine, no coffee, no offering of comfort. The boys were asleep. George could hear the faint hum of a nightlight down the hallway. It grounded him. Beverly folded her hands on the table. "I'm not here to relive the past," she said evenly. "I've already survived it." George nodded. "I understand." "No," she corrected gently. "You're starting to." The difference mattered. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were papers, typed, organized, precise. George didn't touch them yet. "These are my terms," Beverly continued. "They are not negotiable. Not now. Possibly not ever." Her voice never wavered. "First," she said, "any contact you have with the boys will be supervised." George swallowed. "By you?" "No, by a licensed family specialist. Neutral, court-approved." He nodded again. No argument. "Second," Beverly continued, "you will not use money as leverage. No gifts over a set value. No trust funds. No public gestures. If you want to impress them, you show up. I won't, she raised a finger. Let me finish. George stopped immediately. Third, she said, consistency. That means if you say you're coming, you come. If you can't, you explain why. Once, not excuses, explanations. Her eyes sharpened slightly. They have already learned what silence feels like. George felt the sting of it, but he didn't flinch. I accept, he said. Beverly watched him closely. No, she said. You will accept. Over and over again. This isn't a contract you sign once. She leaned back slightly. This is not forgiveness, George. He met her gaze. I know. You don't get to rewrite history, she continued. You don't get to make speeches. You don't get to cry in front of them until they feel responsible for your pain. I wouldn't. You might, she said calmly. People do when they're ashamed. George exhaled slowly. Then I'll learn not to. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Beverly spoke again. There will be lawyers, she said. Custody arrangements, evaluations, time. This will move at the pace that keeps them safe, not at the pace that makes you feel better. George nodded. I don't need to feel better, he said. I need to be present. Something flickered across her face. Not forgiveness. Recognition. She stood. Our lawyer will contact yours, she said. Your first supervised visit is scheduled for Saturday. 1 hour. 1 hour. It felt impossibly small, and terrifyingly large. George stood as well. Thank you, he said quietly. Beverly looked at him. This isn't kindness, she replied. It's protection. She walked him to the door. As George stepped into the hallway, Beverly paused. One more thing, she said. He turned. If you disappear again, she said evenly, we won't do this twice. The door closed softly. George stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then he walked away. Saturday came faster than he expected. George sat in his car outside the family center, hands gripping the steering wheel. Inside the building were 3 boys who shared his DNA and none of his memories. 3 strangers. He had read parenting books, what he had rehearsed sentences. None of it mattered. Because when he stepped inside, when he finally saw them waiting, small, uncertain, holding on to their mother's hands, he realized something devastatingly simple. Love didn't recognize intent, only presence. And he was about to meet the consequences of his absence. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. George noticed it the moment he stepped into the room. White walls, soft lighting, a low shelf of toys that looked like they'd been chosen by committee. Neutral, safe, nothing sharp, nothing breakable, nothing personal. He stood near the door, hands clasped behind his back like a schoolboy waiting to be called on. Across the room, Mike, Peter, and Tom sat on a small couch. They were lined up neatly, feet dangling above the floor, jackets still zipped. 3 identical faces, 3 different expressions. Mike leaned forward, curious, but guarded. Peter stared at the carpet, tracing invisible patterns with his sneaker. Tom pressed close to Beverly's side, one small hand curled into her sleeve. They didn't smile. They didn't frown. They looked polite. George swallowed. This was worse than anger. The family specialist, a woman with calm eyes and a clipboard resting on her lap, cleared her throat gently. Good morning, everyone, she said. We're just going to spend some time together today. No pressure. No expectations. George nodded too quickly. Beverly didn't look at him. She sat in a chair slightly to the side, posture straight, hands folded, her face unreadable. Not hostile. Watchful. George took a tentative step forward. Hi, he said. 3 heads lifted. Mike tilted his head. Hi. Peter echoed it softly. Hi. Tom didn't speak. George felt his chest tighten. I'm George, he continued. You can call me George, or... He stopped himself. Beverly's words echoed in his head. No pressure, no promises. He let the sentence die. The boys nodded, as if that was enough information for now. Silence stretched. George glanced at the shelf of toys like a lifeline. Do you like cars? He asked, reaching for a small wooden set. Too fast. Too eager. Peter flinched slightly at the movement. George froze. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I should have asked first. Mike shrugged. Cars are okay. Tom's eyes flicked to the toy, then back to Beverly. She gave a small nod. Permission, not encouragement. George picked up the box and placed it gently on the table between them. He didn't sit. He knelt. It felt important. They watched him assemble the track slowly, deliberately, narrating each step as if it mattered. This one turns, he said quietly, and this one goes straight. Mike leaned forward a fraction. Peter followed. Tom stayed still, but his eyes didn't leave George's hands. George pushed a small red car along the track. It rolled, tipped, stopped. Mike reached out and corrected it without a word. Their fingers brushed. George's breath caught. Sorry, Mike said automatically. No, George replied softly. That was, thank you. Mike blinked, surprised. Something shifted, barely perceptible, but real. They took turns pushing the car. No laughter, no stories, just movement. Minutes passed. George became acutely aware of every choice, how close he leaned, how loud his voice was, how long he held eye contact. He wanted to say so much. I missed you. I didn't know. I would have come. He said none of it, because none of it mattered yet. Peter reached for another toy, a soft dinosaur with a missing eye. It's a T-Rex, Peter said, offering it awkwardly. George accepted it like a gift. Can I see? He asked. Peter nodded. George made the dinosaur walk the car track slowly. Mike smiled before he could stop himself. It wasn't big, but it was there. Beverly noticed. She didn't react. The specialist made a small note on her clipboard. George's heart pounded. Tom shifted closer. He didn't touch George, but he sat closer to the table. That felt monumental. George reached into his jacket pocket and stopped himself. No gifts. He exhaled slowly and withdrew his hand empty. Tom watched the movement. Why did you do that? Tom asked quietly. George hesitated. Because, he said carefully, sometimes it's better to wait. Tom considered that, then nodded once. The hour moved faster after that, still careful, still restrained, but warmer. When the specialist announced the time was nearly up, George felt a wave of panic he hadn't expected. Already? He stood slowly. I liked playing with you, he said. Thank you for letting me. Mike nodded. Peter nodded. Tom looked at Beverly. She met his eyes, then nodded. Tom turned back to George. Okay, he said. George smiled, small, respectful. As Beverly gathered their jackets, George stayed where he was. He didn't reach out. Didn't ask for more. When they reached the door, Mike hesitated. He turned back. Will you come again? He asked. George's throat tightened. Yes, he said. If you want me to? Mike nodded. The door closed. George sat down heavily in the small chair, and the room felt emptier than it had before. The specialist watched him carefully. You did well, she said. George shook his head. I didn't, he replied. I just didn't make it worse. She smiled slightly. Sometimes that's where it starts. She glanced at her clipboard. I'll file my report, she said. You'll hear soon. Soon. George nodded. Outside, he sat in his car for a long time before turning the key. 1 hour, and everything depended on how it was written down. He stared at the building, heart pounding. Because, for the first time in his life, the future he wanted wasn't something he could buy. It was something he had to be allowed into. George Bunny resigned on a Tuesday morning. There was no scandal attached to it, no dramatic press conference. It's like no carefully crafted narrative about new ventures or personal focus. Just a memo. Effective immediately, George Bunny would be stepping down from his role as active CEO. The board was stunned. His assistant cried. Investors panicked. George didn't flinch. He closed his office door for the last time, ignoring the awards on the walls, the framed magazine covers, the photo of himself ringing the opening bell at the stock exchange. These things had once defined him. Now they felt like artifacts from a life that didn't quite fit anymore. He left the building alone. No entourage, no driver. Just a man walking into a city that didn't care who he used to be. The penthouse sold faster than expected. A foreign investor. Cash offer. No contingencies. George signed the papers without sentiment. On his final night there, so he stood by the windows and looked out at the city he had conquered. The skyline glittered the same way it always had. He felt nothing. The silence didn't echo anymore. It simply existed. He packed lightly. Clothes, books. A single framed photo. 3 boys sitting side by side on a couch, their expressions cautious but curious. The only picture Beverly had allowed him to keep. He placed it carefully in a box marked fragile. The house he bought was 20 minutes from Beverly's apartment. 2 stories. White siding. A small backyard that needed work. It wasn't impressive. It was intentional. The realtor talked too much about resale value. George barely listened. He was focused on the bedrooms. 3 of them, small and identical, clustered at the end of the hallway. He stood there long after the papers were signed. Empty rooms. Possibility. He didn't hire a designer. He went to a hardware store, stood awkwardly in the children's aisle, staring at paint swatches, second-guessing every choice. Blue felt too obvious. Green too cold. He called Beverly. "What color do they like?" he asked quietly. There was a pause. "They like stars," she said. "Anything with stars." George bought glow-in-the-dark decals. He assembled 3 small beds himself. They were crooked. He fixed them, then fixed them again. He built shelves, bought books. A few toys approved by the specialist. No excess, no statements, just readiness. Therapy was harder than he expected. Not because it was painful, but because it was precise. "You built an identity around being indispensable," the therapist said one afternoon. "What happens when you're no longer needed?" George stared at the floor. "I learn how to be useful," he said finally. "Not impressive." They talked about control, about avoidance, about how silence can be a form of violence when someone is asking to be seen. George didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He listened. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he didn't. Either way, he kept showing up. The media lost interest quickly. A few follow-up articles. Some speculation. Then silence. George noticed when his phone stopped ringing. When invitations dried up. When people who once needed him no longer remembered his name. It felt lighter. He stopped correcting headlines. Stopped reading comments. Stopped caring. Worth, he was learning, didn't need witnesses. The call came on a Thursday. The family specialist's number. George answered on the first ring. "We've reviewed the reports," she said. "Including continued evaluations." His heart pounded. "There were no concerns," she continued. "The boys expressed comfort, curiosity. No distress." George closed his eyes. "We're approving an unsupervised visit," she said. "One afternoon, short, structured." George couldn't speak. "You'll receive guidelines," she added. "This is a test, not a reward." "I understand," he said hoarsely. When the call ended, George sat on the floor of the half-finished bedroom, his back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling where faint stars glowed. One afternoon, no supervisor, no buffer. Just him. And 3 boys who were no longer strangers, but not yet his. He stood slowly, straightened the beds, checked the locks, prepared. Because everything he had given up had led to this, and everything that mattered was about to begin. George arrived 10 minutes early. He parked across the street from Beverly's building and turned the engine off, then on again, then off. His hands rested on the steering wheel longer than necessary. No supervisor, no clipboard, no safety net. Just him. When the front door opened, the boys stepped out in a line. Mike first, confident but watchful. Peter close behind, eyes scanning. Tom last, gripping Beverly's hand. They wore sneakers and light jackets. Backpacks slung over their shoulders like they were going somewhere important. They were. George stepped out of the car slowly. "Hi," he said. "Hi," Mike replied. Peter nodded. Tom didn't let go of Beverly's hand. George crouched slightly, so he wasn't towering over them. "Are you ready?" he asked. "We can go to the park, or somewhere else." If you want." Mike glanced at his brothers. "The park is okay," George smiled. "Okay." Beverly knelt in front of them, adjusting collars, smoothing hair. She spoke quietly, firmly. "I'll be right here when you get back," she said. "You listen. You stay together. You tell me if anything feels wrong." The boys nodded in unison. Tom looked at George. "You promise to bring us back?" he asked. George's chest tightened. "Yes," he said. "I promise." Tom hesitated, then let go of Beverly's hand. They walked to the car together. George opened the back doors, checking the car seats one last time, like he hadn't already checked them 3 times that morning. He buckled each of them in carefully, narrating what he was doing without realizing it. "This clicks here, and this one goes over your shoulder. Comfortable?" Mike tested the straps. "Yeah." Peter stared out the window. Tom watched George's hands intently. When George closed the door and climbed into the driver's seat, the reality of it hit him all at once. He was alone with them. He pulled into traffic slowly, hyper-aware of every movement. "Where are we going?" Peter asked. "There's a park a few blocks away," George replied. "It has swings, and a big slide." Mike perked up. "The tall one?" George smiled. "The tallest." The park was quiet. Late morning, sun filtering through green leaves, the air warm but not heavy. George parked and turned to face them. "Okay," he said. "Same rules as your mom said. Stay where I can see you." They piled out of the car, energy contained but buzzing. Mike ran ahead, stopping just short of the playground as if waiting for permission. George nodded. They exploded into motion. Smike went straight for the swings. Peter circled the climbing structure, testing each bar carefully. Tom stayed close, fingers brushing George's sleeve as they walked. George pushed Mike on the swing, counting softly. 1, 2, 3. Mike laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. George froze for half a second, just listening. That sound didn't belong to him. He didn't deserve it, but it existed anyway. Peter climbed the ladder slowly, methodical. "Watch me," he called. "I'm watching," George said. Tom sat beside George on a bench, feet not quite touching the ground. "Do you come here a lot?" Tom asked. "No," George replied honestly. "This is my first time." Tom nodded, as if that made sense. After the playground came ice cream, a small shop on the corner, bright and loud and overwhelming. George let them choose. Mike picked chocolate, and Peter chose vanilla. Tom stared at the options for a long time before pointing at strawberry. They sat outside on a low wall, legs swinging, ice cream dripping dangerously close to disaster. Tom smeared pink across his nose. Peter noticed first. "You have a mustache." Tom frowned. "I do?" George handed him a napkin. "A very serious one." Tom wiped his face and laughed. a small, surprised sound, like it had escaped him by accident. George laughed too. It felt fragile. They talked about small things, favorite animals, which superhero was fastest, why pigeons walked funny. Nothing heavy, nothing loaded. And yet, with every minute, George felt the weight of what he'd missed pressing harder. This ordinary joy, shouldn't have felt new. He watched Mike run ahead, Peter lag behind, Tom pausing to wait for both. They had a rhythm, a shared history. He was stepping into the middle of it, careful not to disrupt what he hadn't helped build. On the drive back, the boys were quieter. Ice cream had given way to contentment. Peter leaned his head against the window. Mike hummed something under his breath. Tom watched George in the rearview mirror. "You did good today," Tom said suddenly. George swallowed. "Thank you." "Will you come again?" Tom asked. "Yes," George said, "if your mom says it's okay." Tom nodded, satisfied. When they pulled back up to Beverly's building, George felt the familiar dread of endings. He unbuckled them slowly. Beverly stood by the door, arms crossed loosely, watching every movement. Her expression was unreadable. The boys ran to her. Words tumbled out all at once, swings, ice cream, the tall slide, the pigeon that stole Mike's napkin. So Beverly listened, eyes flicking briefly to George. He stayed where he was, gave space. Tom turned back before going inside. "Bye," he said. "Bye," George replied. Beverly placed a hand on Tom's shoulder and guided them inside. The door closed. George stood on the sidewalk, staring at it long after the noise inside faded. Across the street, Beverly watched through the window. She had seen the smiles, heard the laughter, and felt the unfamiliar pull of something she hadn't planned for. Hope. It scared her more than anger ever had, because hope meant risk, and risk had nearly destroyed her once before. The headlines came back without warning. They always did. George woke up to his phone buzzing on the nightstand, a vibration that felt louder than it should have in the quiet room. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, in already knowing what he would see when he picked it up. Bunny Air steps back. Is it damage control or daddy duty? Billionaire fatherhood rebrand. Court documents reveal ongoing custody talks. George set the phone down without opening any of them. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his face slowly, grounding himself in the present. 3 small beds down the hall. Glow in the dark stars still faintly visible on the ceiling. This was real. The rest was noise. But noise had consequences. By noon, his former assistant had left 3 voicemails. The board wanted a meeting. Investors were nervous again. A reporter had been seen near the family center. George didn't call anyone back. Instead, he drove to the small cafe near Beverly's apartment and waited. She arrived on time, the boys in school, her posture calm but alert. She didn't sit immediately. She scanned the room first, then chose a table in the corner. George stood as she approached. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. She nodded once. "You said it was important." "It is." They sat. George slid his phone across the table, screen dark. "They're circling again," he said. "The media, the board. Everyone who thinks they're entitled to our lives." Beverly folded her hands. "Our." George met her eyes. "The boys." That earned him a pause. "I won't speak about them," he continued. "Not in interviews, not in statements, not even vaguely." Beverly studied him. "That's not how this usually goes." "I know," George said. "That's why I'm telling you now." She leaned back slightly. "And the business fallout?" He exhaled. "It's real. I could stabilize things if I stepped back in publicly, or played the role they want." "And?" Beverly asked. "And that would put the boys in the spotlight," George said quietly. "So I won't." Something in Beverly's expression shifted, not softened, but recalibrated. "They'll try to get to me," she said. "I know," They already have, she added. I've said no. George nodded. Thank you. This isn't loyalty, Beverly replied evenly. It's protection. I understand. The cafe door opened. George stiffened instinctively. Beverly noticed. Relax, she said. This is what it looks like. Being careful. Later that week, the court date was set. Not dramatic, not adversarial, but real. Evaluations, documentation, witnesses, timelines. George sat across from his lawyer, listening as options were laid out like chess pieces. If you want more time, the lawyer said, we can argue capacity, resources, stability. George shook his head. No pressure. The lawyer frowned. You're entitled to. I know what I'm entitled to, George interrupted. That's not the point. He signed what needed signing, accepted what needed accepting. When the filing hit public record, speculation exploded. Why wasn't he fighting harder? Why wasn't he leveraging influence? Why wasn't he being George Bunny? The answer didn't fit a headline. Beverly felt it too. A woman approached her outside the school one afternoon, polite, smiling, too curious. Must be nice, the woman said lightly, having all that support now. Beverly's response was immediate, calm, firm. My children don't belong to the public, she said, and neither does my past. That night, George called her. I heard, he said. They won't stop, Beverly replied. No, George agreed, but I will. The next morning, he declined an invitation that would have restored his influence overnight. The offer came with conditions, a public appearance, a carefully worded statement, a family photo. George read it once, then deleted it. When asked later why he'd turned it down, he answered simply, My children don't need a brand, they need a father. The quote went viral. So did the backlash. Some praised him, others tore him apart. George didn't watch any of it. He was too busy helping Mike with homework, listening to Peter talk about a dream, letting Tom fall asleep on his shoulder during a movie. Still, the tension crept in. One missed call, one delayed response, one moment taken out of context. Beverly felt it constantly, the tightrope beneath her feet, the fear that one wrong move could undo everything. One mistake, one misstep, one headline too far. She watched George carefully, not for grand gestures, for consistency, because progress was fragile, and the world was waiting for him to fail. It happened on an ordinary evening. No reporters, no court papers, no dramatic trigger. Just a quiet Tuesday, rain tapping softly against the windows, the boys spread across the living room floor with crayons and paper. George sat cross-legged nearby, pretending not to notice how Mike kept glancing at the door every time a car passed outside. Peter was drawing carefully, straight lines, deliberate shapes. Tom lay on his stomach, chin propped on his hands, watching George instead of his page. Beverly moved in and out of the kitchen, the smell of soup warming the air. Normal. And that, George had learned, was when the hardest questions came. So Tom spoke first. You're coming on Saturday, right? George looked up immediately. Yes. Tom nodded, but his eyes didn't leave George's face. Mike spoke next, casual but too practiced. You didn't come last year. The words landed gently and still hit like a blow. George didn't rush to answer. I know, he said quietly. Peter finally looked up. Was it because of us? Beverly froze in the doorway. George felt his chest tighten, the instinct to reassure flaring instantly. Of course not. Never. I'd never leave again. The promises lined up on his tongue. He swallowed them. He shifted closer to the boys, lowering himself to their level. No, he said carefully. It wasn't because of you. Tom's voice was small. But you left. Yes, George said. I did. The room went still. Rain tapped louder against the glass. Mike frowned. Will you do it again? There it was. The question George had been dreading. You won't leave again, right? Beverly's eyes were on him now, not sharp, not angry. Watching. George took a breath. I don't know how to say this without lying, he said slowly. Tom scooted closer. George met their eyes one by one. I left before because I didn't know how to stay, he said. And because I didn't listen. That was my fault. Mike's hands curled into his sleeves. So, will you stay now? George closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, his voice was steady. I'm going to try, he said. Every day, even when it's hard. Even when I mess up. Peter tilted his head. But you might mess up? Yes, George said. Tom looked scared. Then what? Then, George said gently, I won't disappear. I'll talk. I'll explain. And I'll come back. It wasn't a promise. It was something harder. Truth. The boys absorbed that quietly. Mike didn't look fully convinced, but he didn't look dismissed either. Peter nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. Tom leaned forward and rested his head against George's arm. George didn't move. He barely breathed. Beverly watched from the doorway, her heart aching in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel yet. Later, after the boys were in bed, she poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to George. They sat at the small kitchen table. You didn't promise them forever, she said. George shook his head. That felt wrong. It was, Beverly agreed. She sipped her tea. They've had too many promises already. George stared into his cup. I wanted to. I know. Silence settled comfortably between them. I see the work, Beverly said finally. I see the changes. George looked up. That doesn't mean I forgive you, she continued calmly. It means I'm paying attention. I'm not asking for forgiveness, George replied. That's good, she said, because forgiveness isn't the same as trust. He nodded. Beverly stood and collected the empty cups. There's a hearing next month, she said. Things could change. I know. And you're bored? She asked. George didn't hesitate. They'll manage. She studied him for a moment. This life you're choosing, she said. It's smaller. George smiled faintly. It's heavier. Beverly nodded. As George prepared to leave, Tom padded down the hallway in socked feet. He stopped in front of George, hesitating. George crouched instinctively. Tom reached out and handed him a folded piece of paper. Your picture, he said. George unfolded it carefully. 3 stick figures, one taller, holding hands. He swallowed hard. Thank you, he whispered. Tom nodded once and went back to bed. George stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. Then he left. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city felt quiet. And somewhere ahead, between what he had lost and what he was trying to build, a final choice waited. One that would prove whether honesty was enough, or whether showing up would finally cost him something he couldn't walk away from. There was no single moment when everything changed. No announcement. No celebration. No dramatic turning point. Life simply settled. Saturday mornings became routine. George arrived at 9 sharp, not a minute early, not a minute late. He parked in the same spot, knocked the same way. Ahaz waited the same few seconds before Beverly opened the door. Sometimes the boys were already dressed, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes Mike argued about shoes. Sometimes Peter forgot his backpack. Sometimes Tom clung to Beverly's leg longer than usual. George learned not to rush any of it. He learned that presence wasn't about efficiency. It was about patience. They did ordinary things. Library visits, grocery runs, homework at the small kitchen table. George packed lunches badly at first. Too much food. Then not enough. He burned toast. Overcooked pasta. Forgot to cut apples into slices. The boys corrected him. He listened. Weeks passed. then months. The calendar filled with penciled-in notes instead of court dates. George stopped counting progress in milestones and started counting it in habits. He showed up when he said he would. See, he left when it was time to leave. He explained when plans changed. He apologized when he got it wrong. No speeches, no explanations, just repetition. One evening, while helping Peter with a school project, George realized something quietly devastating. The boys no longer watched him constantly. They no longer tracked his movements with anxious eyes. They played while he cooked. They argued while he folded laundry. They assumed he would still be there. That assumption was everything. On a Sunday afternoon, as George buckled them into the car after dinner, Mike leaned forward unexpectedly and wrapped his arms around George's neck. "See you Sunday, Daddy," he said. The word landed softly, not tentative, not tested, natural. George froze for half a second. Then he hugged Mike back, gentle, careful, grateful. "I'll be here," he said. So Peter climbed in next, already talking about a science project. Tom lingered. He looked up at George, serious. "You came again," he said. George smiled. "I did." Tom nodded, satisfied, and climbed into his seat. Across the sidewalk, Beverly watched. Her arms were folded, not defensively, but protectively. She saw the ease now, the lack of tension, the way the boys moved around George without hesitation. She didn't smile, but she didn't look afraid either. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, Beverly stood at the window and watched George's car disappear down the street. She thought about the man he used to be. She thought about the damage that could never be undone. She thought about the years she had survived without him. Some losses were permanent. She would never get those years back. Neither would he. But consistency had a way of building something new, not as a replacement, but as its own quiet truth. George didn't ask for more time. He accepted what he was given. And Beverly noticed. Forgiveness still hadn't come. It might never. But trust, careful, conditional, earned one ordinary day at a time, had begun to take shape. Not loudly, not perfectly, but steadily. And that was enough. For now. Some people think redemption is dramatic, that it arrives with tears and speeches and sudden change. It doesn't. Redemption is boring. It's showing up when no one is watching. It's staying when leaving would be easier. It's choosing the same hard thing again tomorrow. Some losses never heal, but presence, real, consistent presence, can still matter. Even then. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Comment the city you're watching from. Your support helps this channel grow and brings you more powerful stories like this. Thank you for showing up. End of story.